You're gonna need a bigger boat. Why so serious?
I am Iron Man.
This is a tasty burger.
Welcome to the In Session Film Podcast.
Welcome to this podcast review for July 2nd, 2023. And I'm JD Duran.
And I'm Brendan Cassidy.
Hey, thanks for joining us, everybody. Who's ready for an adventure?
Ooh, I am. I'm ready to crack that whip.
Crack the whip, avoid the snakes, fly on planes through maps. You know, all of the above.
It sounds as though we're on an adventure where the backing noise sounds a little bit like...
Yeah, gotta have that theme. Yeah, exactly. Something weird and supernatural's gotta happen.
Something religious, something historical.
Exactly. So, you know, it's Indiana Jones.
It is.
You know, it's interesting. You know, I saw this film a few weeks ago now, but it's a little bit poetic though, because I got a chance to take my 7-year-old son to see this movie in a theater.
Right. That's right.
And like all of you watching, listening to this, I grew up on these movies.
Uh-huh.
You know, the first one came out before I was born, but when I was 6 and 7 years old, I was watching Indiana Jones as well.
Sure.
And here we are, 35-ish years later, or whatever the math is. I'm not very good at it.
It's like at this point now, I don't even know how old I am anymore.
Exactly.
I just know I have a 7-year-old, is according to your point of view.
Exactly. All these years later, I get to take my son, who, when I was his age, I was watching these movies and playing Indiana Jones, and then I get to take him to see Indiana Jones, a new movie in a theater. It was very touching. It was very moving, just that on its own.
Sure, yeah.
And then, and I'm going to get into this now. I'm sure we'll talk about John Williams as we actually get into the conversation, but there's a couple of times where, of course, he brings back that iconic theme.
Yep.
And every time, and I mean every time, my son would tug on my shirt to get my attention, and I will look down at him, and he would reverberate this palpable joy being invested in this movie with that theme playing. He was getting so excited, and to see that, to take me back to my childhood, and you know how I feel about scores and John Williams now.
Oh yeah.
I mean, it was incredible poetry. Like it's one of those moments that you just don't forget as a parent.
Is it possible? Incredible. Is it possible that that experience may have bled into your feelings on the Dial of Destiny?
Maybe we'll get into it. That certainly doesn't hurt the experience.
No, of course not. I'm not saying it should.
Oh no, I know.
It creates a completely different vibe. You know, like I mean, your son reacting so positively to this experience, of course, is going to please the dad who is introducing the film to him. And that's just the way it works, right? And we introduce some of our favorite films to like our family members or our friends. And if we see that they're enjoying it, it almost makes us enjoy that product even more. It's just how it works.
Yeah. And no, I completely agree. In fact, I have been doing this with some friends right now. We're watching the Harry Potter series.
Oh, nice.
And I'm watching these films with them for the first time, and you know, talking about each film after we watch it. And of course, we've done that a lot here on the show, but I've never had conversations with these guys about Harry Potter before. And they haven't seen these movies in a long time. In fact, last night, as we were watching Azkaban last night, and one of them was like, she was like, I don't remember anything that happens in this movie. So like, we had to treat it like a first time watch.
It's kind of like that moment when you and I first got together on In Session Film, and I forced you to watch these movies again, the Harry Potter movies.
Yeah, exactly. 100%. Yeah. So, you know, you have those conversations, and it's always fascinating. So, but yeah, I mean, what's circling it back to Indiana Jones though. It's interesting because when I think about it in the context of Sam, I had shown him these movies some years ago, perhaps right before the pandemic, maybe. I'm trying to recall. But he had
And
seen these
you've
movies
shown him
before.
all four. You've shown him all
Yep.
four of them. Okay,
Yeah,
which one was his favorite?
Raiders for
He
sure.
likes Raiders. Okay, cool.
Yeah, Raiders, and maybe that was because it was the first one. I don't know, but
Makes sense. Makes
he's
sense.
always loved Raiders. Plus, they have the Indiana Jones ride at Disney, which is
Oh
Raiders
yeah,
inspired.
yeah,
So that's
yeah. You're
part of
right.
it as well. So he's seen these movies. He's acted it out. He's played as Indiana Jones. Like he's done the whole shebang. I, at that time, had no idea that they would be making another movie. So,
Not directed by Steven Spielberg. Let's add that as well.
for sure, for sure. So, it's interesting. Like we've gone down the Indiana Jones rabbit hole, but, I still didn't anticipate that I would get to see it in a theater with him. So,
Oh, sure. Yeah. I bet that was a really poignant experience. I'm kind
it
of
was.
envious of that, honestly, that you got to have that almost passing of the torch. I mean, we talk about Indiana Jones as a franchise being one of the most nostalgically driven franchises in most people's respective upbringings, right? So
Yeah,
the fact that it's literally now become this full circle for you and your son, because I'm sure someone in your family maybe turned you on to these movies when you were younger. So it,
sure.
it, it literally becomes this repetition that kind of speaks to the whole volume of the franchise itself, I think.
Yeah, I agree for sure. And I've been thinking a lot about that over these last 2 weeks leading up to the release. And it certainly helps that and I guess this is a transition into the conversation a little bit because
Mhm.
I think I enjoyed this film a lot more than most people have seemed to. I don't think that Sam being there is conflating with my critical analysis of it. I'll certainly get
We'll talk about
into
that. Yeah.
why I don't think it's as great as some of the others in this franchise, but I
Mhm.
on the whole did enjoy it. Before we get into Dial of Destiny though, real fast, what was your pre dial ranking of the franchise?
It was release order. It's
Okay.
weird to say because very rarely does that happen in a franchise for me, is that release order ends up being my order of preference. Which most people listening might realize what I'm saying is I actually like Temple of Doom more than Last Crusade.
Yeah.
I do. And maybe it's a nostalgic thing because I was always really into that movie when I was younger. I like the sheer weirdness of it. And as I've gotten older and compared it with the modern landscape of blockbusters nowadays, I've come to respect that film even more for its meanness. I mean, it's such a mean movie, and I think that's why I still rank that one so highly in this franchise. The first two, I love Raiders and Temple of Doom. Raiders, especially, I think is at the very least maybe a top 5 Spielberg film, one of the greatest action movies ever made.
Sure.
I really like Last Crusade. I don't love it as much as most other people. I don't really want to get too heavily into it because I don't want this to turn into a Last Crusade review.
Yeah.
I'll just say I don't like it as much as most other people.
Okay.
But I still enjoy it. That's a film for context, I'll say I gave that, I think, like a 3.5 out of 5 on Letterboxd. So it's still a very good, entertaining film for me. And then Crystal
Sure.
Skull is Crystal Skull. It's
Yeah.
Crystal Skull. I don't really hate that movie. I've come to respect that one a little bit more for its weirdness, but it's not necessarily good weirdness. It's just
Yeah.
that is such a broken film. It's such a broken product, and the
Yeah.
biggest sin that film commits is I just don't find it all that. I just find it kind of dull, honestly, and that's, I think, the
Yeah.
worst thing about it. It gets weird at times where I think it needs to be, and there's some good sequences there, but easily the worst of the 4. So yeah, release order. Long-winded way of me saying release order is my my
Okay.
history of this franchise.
Well, I know that I'm certainly not alone in my ranking here as it's Raiders 1, Last Crusade, then Temple of Doom,
Mm-hmm.
and Crystal Skull.
Mm-hmm.
Raiders, I agree with you. It's certainly one of the best action films. It's one of Spielberg's best movies. The Last Crusade, though, and maybe this is I don't know how others feel about this. Based off of the discourse online, it sounds like there are certainly others that do. So you and I, at the very least, will have some disparity here because,
Sure.
like, my disparity between Raiders and The Last Crusade isn't all that much. I really like The Last
Yeah,
Crusade.
I know a
quite lot.
lot of people who put Last Crusade as number one of all of these
Yeah.
films.
It's pretty
not an
close.
uncommon opinion for a lot of people.
Yeah, those films are pretty much 1A and 1B as far as I'm concerned.
Wow.
Temple of Doom, I really do like. I don't think it's aged particularly well in some places, but
That I agree with. I don't disagree with that.
and
It is not the most pleasant or dare I say ethical of films
yeah,
nowadays.
yeah, and I think there's just some writing things about it that I don't think works very well, even in the context of the time. But especially now, I don't think it works all that great. And I'm with you with Crystal Skull. The only thing that saves that film from being an utter disaster is Spielberg's craft.
Yeah.
He, as a director, makes that film compelling to watch, even though it is arguably at times unwatchable.
It has an energy to it. It's the way it moves, even despite, Janusz Kaminski and his visual eye cinematographer there, I don't think really matches the world of Indiana Jones in that particular film. You could definitely sense a lot of the artificiality that's going on from a visual standpoint in that movie. But it's the way the film is edited, the way it's told, that you could definitely sense Spielberg trying to imbue that film with some personality. But I will say with Crystal Skull, I think it opens very well. The first third, basically all the way up until that final motorcycle chase through the college with Mutt, Shia LaBeouf's character. I think the movie's actually pretty good up until that point.
Yeah.
And that's including the nuke the fridge sequence, which never really bothered me. I have to admit that never really bothered me, but there are good things in that movie. I at least want to say that.
I mean, I don't know if like none of the things in terms of the oddities of Indiana Jones, I think it's kind of silly to be bothered by those things. However, I will say this, and because I'm going to get into that even when we get to Dial of Destiny.
Sure.
But I will say this. Of all the things that Indiana Jones as a franchise introduces, as wild and bizarre and insane as it is, I do think the fridge nuke sequence is the most eye-rolly moment of
it's
of
very
all of them.
but it's
so
not
insane.
I mean it's certainly more eye-rolly than most of what came before it in this franchise, but that's not to say the franchise has been devoid of eye-rolly moments.
Oh my god.
And this is what I love about what Spielberg brings to these movies, because as much as I love Temple of Doom, there's a lot that you have to take with a real small grain of salt with regard to its practicality and what you can get away with. And but I think what Spielberg does very well is, let's say in sequences like the tram chase in Temple of Doom, right? Or the inflating of a raft midair after it exits an airplane.
Oh
right?
my gosh. Yes.
Yeah. But somehow it's ridiculous. It's ridiculous.
So
but
absurd.
Somehow I don't know what Spielberg does to showcase it in this way, but I still feel like there's like a sense of gravity to it. Like there is this density to it that it almost feels like, okay, for some reason I'm buying into this. And that's the Spielberg magic, knowing how to understand the fabrication of physics, where I don't question it too much, I guess. I don't know. He's just so good at visualizing these things.
I admire your optimism.
I'm bringing that up. I'm bringing that up as a precursor for what I'm about to say about Dial of Destiny to contradict that. So that's why I'm saying it this way.
Because I definitely don't come at it from that perspective. I'm very much on the other. Like I watch that. Like this is a franchise where a guy's face melts off. Like, like you think about of all the insane, absurd things. Like, so yes, when a film introduces time travel or aliens or whatever, like those things, like criticizing those things is a moot point as far as I'm concerned. Like those are like, we don't need to even bring any of that up. Like, and I certainly have seen criticisms of that.
Mhm.
For Dial of Destiny, we saw that heavily with Crystal Skull when it came out. Like, that is like him getting nuked in a fridge is the least of my worries when
Well,
it comes
yeah.
to Crystal
The
Skull.
point I'm trying to bring up, I feel like we're getting a little bit off topic, but I feel like it's important when we transition to Dial of Destiny when I talk about the action sequences in that film specifically. So I don't want to get too
Yeah.
ahead of myself, but
Yeah.
when I see the nuking of the fridge, for instance, it's the way the fridge bounces, the way it literally smashes and bashes around that I feel like, okay, there's a sense of gravity to this. Like I feel like there's at least an attempt at practicality within the impractical. Which is what I respect about Spielberg's vision for these movies,
Gotcha.
as if he's trying to blend the supernatural with the natural in some way. Because I've always gone for the lunacy of these movies, the
Okay. I understand what
impracticality
you're
of
saying.
them. Yeah,
Like I still don't necessarily come at it from that point of view. Like
mhm.
the practicality to me diminishes as soon as you introduce the lunacy. At that point,
Okay.
any practicality you bring into it is also a moot point. Like it doesn't really matter.
I know. I
at
feel
that
like we're
point.
talking about
You know what I
nothing
mean?
important right now, but
We're really not.
We're not. But I'm bringing it up because I'm trying to use this.
Yeah,
as a
that's fair because you're trying
Dial
to
of
set up
Destiny.
something else.
I'm trying to set up something else. Yeah.
And I'm saying, and I guess this is important context for where I come into Dial of Destiny as well. Like for me, I don't like that doesn't define Indiana Jones.
No, I'm with you on that. I'm with you.
And
on
I
that.
don't think that defines Spielberg's filmmaking in any of this as well.
I'm with you.
I like with Spielberg's craft and what he brought to Indiana Jones. I think comes down to like the larger set designs and the costuming and just like how I guess the word to describe it for me is how transportative it is.
Oh yeah.
Like he takes us on an adventure that is wild, absolutely insane. None of it makes any sense.
Yeah.
And that's the best part about it.
That is well, see, you're kind of getting into something that I'm sort of alluding to here is the believability or lack of a term.
Lack thereof.
Believability. With those earlier Indiana Jones films, regardless of the topicality of them or what they're depicting and how believable that is, I still feel like that when they travel to a new land, that they're really there. You know, like there is something, like you said, very transportative about them.
Yes. Yeah.
Like there is some weird lived-in quality with them, even despite the religiosity or the fantastical or the science fiction. You know, when it
that I'll agree with. I totally agree with
that's
that.
the Spielberg magic, trying to find that middle ground there.
Yeah, for sure. Okay. I think we eventually found middle
I feel like I've sort of played my cards regarding Dial of Destiny, just given this conversation here.
That's okay. We needed a little bit of pretext there. All right.
Yeah.
So with all of that laid out, let's get into Dial of Destiny. As we have implied, it is not directed. As you know, this is not directed by Steven Spielberg.
Right.
Instead, it is James Mangold, but it does star Harrison Ford alongside Phoebe Waller-Bridge, Toby Jones, Ethan Isidore, and Mads Mikkelsen.
Yeah. A few other
All
big
right.
names in here. Smaller bit parts, but they're in here.
There's a couple of cameos as well. I don't know if we need to reveal those right now.
I feel like the trailer has kind of revealed them, though.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Should we lay it out on the table now? I guess
mean,
people
like-
do know about it.
Like Antonio Banderas. I mean, we did know he was in this movie going into it, and he is in one of the trailers for a very brief shot. You can see him, so
Yeah.
he's in this movie for what feels like 30 seconds, but he's in this movie.
He is in this movie. He exists, as well as like a few other cameos. There are characters from Indiana Jones lore that people will recognize as well.
Yeah. Now, some of those we don't have to get into.
Okay. Those were what I was mostly referring to. But...
Yeah. Those we can be a little bit more cryptic about.
All right. Maybe we can talk about them at the end of this conversation.
It sounds good to me.
All right. Indiana Jones, The Dial of Destiny. Brennan, what did you think?
I was sadly not a fan of this movie. And it kind of gets back into what we were talking about with regard to the first four movies here. Despite whether you like the ridiculousness of those movies or not, there's something about the way Spielberg was able to tap into this fine line between practical and impractical. So when I see something excessively religious happen or fantastical happen, I felt like I was actually there in some way. Whereas the majority of Dial of Destiny felt like a green screen mess to me. It just like, I think this is, from an action film standpoint, this is far and away the worst film in the franchise.
Gotta love that Disney sheen, baby.
It really does not serve this film well at all. I mean, there are times I thought this was an animated movie. Like, I'm sorry, I don't mean to sound mean. And maybe a lot of that also comes down to, you know me, JD. I hate to sound cynical when it comes to any movie review because I love this franchise, and maybe that's why I'm holding it to maybe an unfair standard, because there are at least 3 classics in this franchise that it has to follow. So I think it's maybe a little bit fair to hold it to a higher standard, because we're hoping for something that can at least, fit in the realm of this legendary franchise. But much of this movie felt like a studio mandated product than it did a movie to me. And for most of its runtime, I'd say for the first 2/3, this was my least favorite film in the franchise. There are things I liked about it. I do like Harrison Ford in the role. I think he never half-asses anything that he really does, especially
this. Yeah.
Well, especially this. Yeah. And I will say, I like the idea of this movie, of seeing Indy, our legendary hero, in a world where he doesn't feel like he belongs anymore. In many ways, his reintroduction almost feels a lot like Carl Fredricksen from Up. And I heard a couple other critics make that comparison. I can't take ownership in that. But I do think it's an apt comparison, because he's introduced as this grumpy old man bashing on neighbor apartment doors to keep the volume down. And it's kind of jarring, but I do love that notion. And I think the film overall, where I think it's mostly saved, I think it explores that idea of aging and finding your place in your own history pretty well, which is my way of saying, and I'll end it here before I get into your thoughts. There's going to be a lot of debate on the film's final act, the final 20 minutes specifically. I think it absolutely sticks the landing, and again, it's ridiculous. It goes somewhere that if I were to tell just any person randomly who's maybe passively interested in this movie, and I say where it goes, you're going to be like, oh, that sounds like the worst thing I've ever seen.
I love it.
On paper, it is. I can't believe they did this, but
I can't. It's Indiana Jones.
Well, no, it goes to a place where I was like, oh my God. Wow. And secretly I was thinking, why couldn't this be the whole movie? I guess in many ways I was waiting for that moment, because it was the first time I felt like, okay, now I could sense a personality with this movie, which is what I felt like it was mostly lacking up until that point. And I do think there is some genuine sincerity within the lunacy of that final act. And I think it's a hard balance to strike, but I think that ending mostly earns it. So I came around kind of mixed on the movie overall, because I do think the ending kind of saves it. I was waiting for that lunacy, and when it finally gave it to me, I was like, okay, now I feel like this is the movie they've been promising. This is the movie I personally at least wanted to see. But getting up until that point, I must admit, I thought it was a massive chore. So I guess if I were to rank the franchise now, I feel like I need to add a 6th entry into this. Whereas it'd be Raiders, Temple of Doom, and my third favorite would be the final 20 minutes of this movie.
So it's like the Lone Ranger. Remember how we talked about that?
That is a great comparison. The Lone Ranger, the final 10, 15
like the
minutes?
last 15, it's long. It's like a 15-minute action sequence at the end. That is incredible.
Yeah, for context, for any new listeners of the podcast, we always reference the Lone Ranger being one of those movies that you just release the final 15 minutes of that film as a short film, and it's a masterpiece. It's awesome. An absolute masterpiece. Everything leading up to that masterpiece, kind of unwatchable, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And I'll have to look it up. Maybe I can by the end of this conversation, because I want to say, and I could be wrong, because it's about to celebrate its 10th anniversary. and it might
Yeah.
be today, actually, as of the day we're
Wow.
recording
Oh,
this.
maybe we
So,
need to review that one on the show now.
yeah, yeah. But
Um,
we've always talked about that.
We have,
So I
yeah.
certainly do understand where you're coming from with
Yeah,
that. So,
but I do think that's a great comparison with how I feel about Dial of Destiny. I don't think it's as strong as that movie, at least my reaction to it, because I wouldn't go as far as to say the first 2/3 of Dial of Destiny were unwatchable for me. I just I don't. They felt very passionless to me.
yeah.
And kind of directionless, honestly. And that's really my biggest problem. Something I just don't want to see in movies like this. So, I mean, take that for what it's worth. Kind of a dichotomy of a review on my side.
Okay, I really like this. I'm
Okay.
probably going to say some things in this conversation that many of you listening, watching will disagree with. However, all I ask is that you listen to what I have to say and at least give me the time and the space to articulate why I really liked the film.
Okay. All
Even
right.
though there will be some things that I do agree with Brendan on, and I'll certainly get to those here in a little bit. I think for me, what this mostly comes down to is its heart, which
Mhm.
I think is in the writing of the film, but especially the performances and Harrison Ford. But at the heart of this movie, it is this poignant reflection on Indiana Jones, the character. It's this
Yeah.
beautiful send off that I found really moving. I find this, and again, stick with me here. I think this is comparable to Martin Scorsese in The Irishman or Quentin Tarantino in Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, and how those
Yeah.
films were introspective reflections on their career. This film is doing the same, but for Indiana Jones. It's about him looking at history and wrestling with how it's defined him, why it's such a big part of the nucleus of who he is. And Harrison Ford is so good at tapping into that in his performance. I think the cameos, the aforementioned cameos, the Indiana Jones lore that is echoed in this film, I don't think it's there pandering to the audience. Perhaps at times it is. I don't
Mhm.
think on the whole, though, it's for nostalgia. The film uses Indiana Jones, including those Indiana Jones lore, excuse me, and
Mhm.
including those cameos to amplify this idea of examining history and what it means to Indiana and how that affects his choices throughout this film. That here, I think, is really beautiful. And it's ultimately why I liked it,
Yeah.
especially when you include the Indiana Helena dynamic. There's been a lot of conversation about Helena and Phoebe Waller Bridges' performance here.
Yeah.
But what I really like about this character is that, yes, she is morally ambiguous. She's this
Yeah. Yeah.
prickly, rough around the edges character that's not really defined. And you can look at that as some sort of criticism as far as how well the film establishes that, and maybe it doesn't do it as vividly as it could have. But I do think
Mhm.
it's there when you look at her father, the choices that he made, how that would affect a child, especially when she's left with really no direction. So I
Mhm.
do think the film does enough to imply why she makes these choices or why she's rough around the edges, even if it doesn't tell us flat out directly, here's what happened and why she is this way now.
Right.
I kind of do love that, especially because Indiana Jones, on the whole, the franchise has always been concerned with, again, we're not winning Oscars for writing with these movies, but it establishes these characters well enough that as the adventure goes, you're invested in them in some way, shape, or form. The film
Sure.
succeeds in that for me, as it does with any of the other supporting characters in the previous films. And I love that dynamic, that volatility between Helena and Indiana. And here's the other thing about Helena and what I love about her here.
Mhm.
How she got to where she is as these events start to unfold, I think is less relevant. even if it's a little unclear. For me, I found clarity there, but even if it is unclear, it almost doesn't matter.
I don't mind
it
that.
almost doesn't matter. All we know is that she is looking out for herself because she was forced to, for reasons that we find out as I noted. However, what is incredibly clear is her evolution in this film, how she changes when
she has a very clear arc. I don't
very clear arc.
Yeah.
How she changes when she continuously sees Indiana's sincerity as it relates to history. That is very important. They have conversations about it as their adventure goes, and she sees him interact with the history in front of them. When she sees that sincerity, it changes her in a very tangible way. You want to talk about tangibility, Brendan? There is a tangibility to that arc for her in this film. And I think that, to me, is what I love so much about those final 20 minutes. Again, say what you will about how ludicrous they are. But again, I love the lunacy of these films.
It has symbolic purpose, too. Where this film literally goes actually does serve a purpose in the crystallization of not just Indy's arc, but also Helena's arc. So I absolutely agree with you there.
Yeah, because there comes a moment where he wants to choose history in a very literal, practical way.
Yeah.
He wants to choose history. And I think the film earns that because of how it had very introspectively reflected on Indiana Jones, who he is. He's at this existential part of his life where this is going to be his last hurrah, so to speak.
Yeah.
And he gets to a point where he gets to choose history.
Yeah.
This is who I am. I've lived my whole life for this.
I love that idea.
I absolutely love that. I agree that it sticks to landing, but I also think the film in the first 2/3 had kind of earned that sincerity, that poignancy.
Okay.
And I do love how the film, and this is perhaps where Spielberg's influence comes in the best way, because that sincerity is undermined for a gag. And I feel like if Spielberg was directing this, he would have done the same thing. So I will give James Mangold credit there.
Okay.
So I love the film in terms of that, in terms of Indiana Jones as a reflection on the character. And there is a meta component to this, because it's not just Indiana Jones in the context of the film doing this, but Harrison Ford, us as the audience, we are getting to do the same thing alongside the character, what he has meant to us all these years. As a figure in cinema, as a figure in Harrison Ford's filmography, whom we love.
Yeah.
We get to reflect on that in this film alongside Indiana himself.
Yeah.
That I think is really good here.
And I think that's why you can tell Harrison Ford seemed to be really excited about reprising this character for this particular story, because it essentially turns Indiana Jones himself into kind of a symbolic representation of Indiana Jones. It's like it becomes not just a character, he becomes a symbol for what these movies ultimately meant. And that's why, again, I agree with you. I do think the film sticks the landing in trying to crystallize all of that. It's interesting, JD, it sounds like there's not a whole lot we disagree on. This might be one of those cases where it's like, it really just depends on what aspect of the film we're individually latching onto more. Right. And because where the film is going at, or what it's going at thematically speaking, I really do like that about it. I don't necessarily mind the dynamic between Henry Jones and Helena Shaw. I think their dynamic is okay. I think it's actually kind of playful. And when the arcs need to crystallize in the right way, they more or less earn that, because we've made it to those revelations in those final minutes that really kind of deconstruct it a little bit, recontextualize it a little bit. There's just other things from a practical standpoint that seem to be holding me back. Maybe that's just affecting me more than it is you. And I think that might just be our biggest disparity then.
Well, and I will say this, because I do want to talk about James Mangold.
Okay.
Because this is where I do feel like the film is most polarizing, and it sounds like I will agree with you in a lot of regards when it comes to the filmmaking craft. For me, it's less that it's bland or that it invokes that Disney sheen. I think my biggest issue with the film in terms of Mangold's direction is that it is very, very clearly trying to be an imitation of Spielberg. This is not the James Mangold that we know. If
I
you
don't know
watch
if I
his
agree with
movies,
that.
if you watch his movies, they do not look and feel like this. I think this is him in terms of how the camera moves, in terms of editing, especially pacing. It is him trying to being in an imitation of Spielberg. It fails miserably in that regard, and I think it is really distracting. But to me, that is the biggest problem here. I really didn't have an issue with the adventurous spirit of the film or its action, what it's trying to achieve. Again, because at its heart, it always comes back to that idea of Indiana Jones and reflecting on the character. That is always at the heart of these scenes, even in the action, and especially on the adventure and with characters and how they have these verbal sparring matches throughout the film. Even the plotting of the film, I think, circles back to that idea. However, I could not get away from how Mangold was trying to be not James Mangold, but trying to be Steven Spielberg. And he's not. He does not have the visual eye to be Spielberg. And this felt like at every turn, what would Spielberg do? Well, this is how he would move the camera, or this is how he would edit this, or this is how he would choreograph this. I'm going to try to imitate it. And he does that mimicry absolutely poorly.
Well, and so I guess in a way, I guess I agree and slightly disagree with that statement, because my first reaction was to say that Mangold was trying to mimic Spielberg here would be giving Mangold too much credit. I feel like this movie was directed by artificial intelligence at times. And maybe that is an agreement then, because it does feel like some type of, studio backing project trying to mirror something that already existed aesthetically in this franchise.
So you're saying if you told AI, ChatGPT, to
Yeah.
direct a movie in the vein of Spielberg, this is what it would spit out.
Yes, I absolutely feel that way. And that's maybe that's why I'm so
Fair.
much lesser on this film than you are, because so much of what the film is going for thematically, emotionally, I do agree with you on, and I wanted to latch on to those things, but I found myself getting pulled away whenever I saw, and I maybe we'll disagree on this. I don't think the villains are compelling at all in this. I think Mads Mikkelsen is half-assing it completely here. Boyd Holbrook, I think, is really boring. But from an action film standpoint, I don't think there's a single memorable action sequence in this movie from a practical standpoint. The whole opening sequence involving that train and the blade heist and how that sets up our story, I think, is very poorly choreographed. I'm trying not to latch on to little things, because I don't want it to make it sound like I'm bothered by little things that might not really matter, because I'm really more bothered by, for lack of a better term, the overall sheen of this. It doesn't feel like there was time and effort put into the inspiration of these action sequences. But I also really wish we would just get away from the whole de-aging thing. And I've heard some people say the de-aging of Harrison Ford in those opening minutes, it's kind of half good and kind of half bad. I think it's 110% bad. Like, it never worked for me. It always looked Polar Express like to me. It was always dead in the eyes. And I think the other problem I have too with the action scenes and just the way they try to morph narrative storytelling around them, it really is just that. It's the editing of it all. It feels like it builds to climaxes before it earns that climax. Like introducing Indiana Jones in those opening 20 minutes felt very anticlimactic to me. And I think it's maybe more of a pacing thing, and the way that this was overall storyboarded that just didn't feel like the right approach. It's hard to explain, but it just, every time some major event was meant to occur during these action sequences, I just didn't feel a darn thing. And I hate to say it harshly, I just think they're really poorly conceived.
Okay. I mean, I don't wholly disagree with that. It just doesn't bother me all that much in
And
terms
that's the
of
thing.
the
That's the disparity.
choreography and staging. Because to me, I don't mind the choreography. I don't mind the staging. However, I do mind that the camera is trying to be an imitation. That
Fair.
bothers me.
Fair.
That I can't escape from. Like when Indiana's riding up on that motorcycle and he's trying to jump onto that train and the way it's edited, to me, like I sense Spielberg in that. Like if I
I
was
will.
watching
Yeah.
Spielberg make this movie, he would do something similar, like in a similar vein, but it would be much better crafted than that. And
Well,
I cannot escape the
yeah.
imitation aspect of that. That to me was utterly distracting
I will
at every
say
turn.
the biggest form of imitation to Spielberg and especially Janusz Kaminski's cinematography that I noticed was the chase through the parade of
The
what was it?
parade was another
Yeah.
big one.
Well, and a
Yep,
lot of that came
absolutely.
down to the lighting. Like there are moments when you see Indiana Jones on a horse and he finds his way into the subway. Just the way it was all lit was very reminiscent of Janusz Kaminski at times. And in those moments, I thought, okay, now I can see the Spielberg influence really pulling into this movie, as if it's almost reeking of desperation. And it just like that didn't work for me either for that reason. But even so, just something about the staging and the editing of it just didn't feel climactic or even thrilling to me.
Yeah, I think that's very fair. I mean, I wasn't. I'm not wholly, but I found it thrilling enough. I guess is maybe the
Okay.
best way to
Okay.
articulate it. I was engaged in terms of the characters, the story, and the heart of it. So,
Did
how
you like
the
Mads
action?
Mikkelsen as a villain?
Uh, I don't find him particularly memorable, but
He's not bad,
I
but
don't think he's bad, and honestly, I think he serves the heart of this story. Like he's a little bit of I don't know, a MacGuffin in some ways. Like he's
yeah.
just there. Like the film kind of follows him, and he's driving a lot of the plot, and it gets us from A to B to C, but
Yeah.
really has nothing to do with him in the end.
Yeah.
Does that
I
make
mean, you're
sense?
right. No,
So
you're
like
right.
that's really all that he is to me here, and I think he serves that fine. Don't get me wrong. I don't think he's bad.
Mhm.
I think he just serves his role in a very matter of fact way.
Mhm.
Where this film thrives to me is in its heart, and I think it emphasizes that enough that some of these other middling aspects of the film kind of fall to the wayside for me, especially
Okay.
the action. Like, because to me, like when Harrison Ford and Indiana Jones is on that horse and it's invoking James Cameron, I was like, okay, this is a little bit of fun. Or when he's on the train at the beginning, like again, I can sense the Indiana Jones aesthetic there, especially everything we get at the end and how wild and crazy absurd it is. I was like, this is very Indiana Jones. So like
Mhm.
the setups, I have no problem with. I think there is some fun to be had there, especially if you want to talk about Indiana and Helena and their relationship and how they're, you know, tethered in all of this, such as the boat scene, which we could talk about Antonio Banderas and how underutilized he is in this film, and that is a big problem, I
So
guess.
wasted in this movie.
He
It's
is
so sad.
wasted, but again, if I circle it back to the heart of the story, if Banderas and Mickelson, if they're here just to get us from A to B to C, which ultimately they are, but if I just focus on the heart of it, I still think that is intact when you think about how that scene crystallizes and how they have to work together to escape that situation. And also kind
Yeah.
of the moment pre-leading that when they're talking about what motivates them. And Helena's talking about money, how that kind of derives from what happened to her father, and how the only thing that she's learned in life is that pragmatism of economics. And
Mhm.
Indiana Jones talks about how it's anything but that. And he has this really beautiful line about his wife and how she is involved in where he is at this stage of his life. So
Sure.
Again, like I feel like the conversation, we can talk about the stuff on the periphery. And look, I get it. They're part of the discourse right now. And I understand. We talked about this last week on the main show. When it comes to film, the visual element is significant. It's
Very much.
absolutely
Yeah.
a crucial part of the experience. You cannot divorce the art of film from its visuals. I totally get it. And that's why films that have a visual pleasing aesthetic, that goes a long way, especially when you consider everything we talked about on the main show last week. However, I would equally argue that a film can't just be reliant on visuals. How many times have we seen that?
Yeah.
A film is beautifully lush and everything in the middle is hollow and empty. Like you can have that conversation as well. It's a little bit of both. And where this film perhaps lacks in that visual intuitiveness that a Spielberg would bring, that's lacking here. However, I do think this has a heart that is utterly missing in something like Crystal Skull, for example. So, like, to me, that's where this film makes up for it. And I think it does that send off, that reflection on Indiana. It does that so well. And it emphasizes that from scene to scene, that some of this other stuff, we can criticize it. I think there's merits to those criticisms, don't get me wrong. But I don't think any of it is really what this movie is about.
Well, and it's not just the visuals and the overall aesthetics of the film. It's really just the narrative propulsion that always bothered me too, because every time in those first 2/3 that we had a potentially touching moment between Helena and Henry Ford, or not Henry Ford, Henry Jones here, we
Or
would
Henry
have.
Ford.
I mean, I'm technically calling him Henry Ford at this point now.
Yeah.
Oh man, that was a that was a weird moment there. But every time we have a potentially touching moment between these two characters, you have a character like Teddy coming in to just completely interrupt it, or
Sure.
it just and I think that's the other thing too, is I think there are just way too many characters here. I just don't know if the film is able to juggle it all. So when that heart that you're able to latch onto, that I really wish I could, there are just so many things kind of interrupting the process. But it's not until that moment on the boat that you're talking about, when there is this literal synergy between Helena and Indiana, and in that escape that you're talking about, that's right where the film starts to take off for me. Like, that's the moment where I was beginning to really get engaged. It's just unfortunate that that's almost the 2-hour mark when we get to that point. Because after that, we find ourselves, I think we end up in Syracuse, in Italy when we get to that point.
Yeah.
And then you actually find yourself in the midst of a classic Indiana Jones-like adventure with puzzle solving and dungeons and booby traps and
All that stuff. Yeah.
all that stuff. And I mean, of course, we're always going to like that stuff in an Indiana Jones movie, but by the time it got to that point, I finally felt like, okay, now the movie is finally doing the work to make me care about these two characters together on screen. It was trying to do that before, but too many factors just kept interrupting it. And it just took too long for me to get there. Even though I know that's what the film is going for, it didn't quite get there for me as it seems like it did for you. At least, it didn't get there for me as quickly as it did for you.
I mean, that I was, that to me is where I went from liking the film to borderline loving the film.
I went from hating it to liking it.
Yeah. I mean, for me, like, in terms of, the criticisms of its visuals and Mangold's direction, like, I didn't really think about any of that until after I walked out of the theater.
Okay. Interesting.
I certainly noticed it. And as I noted, the imitation effect was bothersome, but I could look past it because of its heart and what it was doing thematically. And that was more than enough to get me through the moment and the experience in the theater.
That's fair.
That I really did enjoy. And then I get home and then you start to think about the movie and its visuals, where it is distracting. But in the moment, in the experience, all I cared about was how engaged I was with it's hard, and I was more than engaged. And then once things start to take off and you get into that third act, it just becomes all the more captivating. So, in the end, like this is easily, um, I like this way more than Crystal Skull. I borderline, and this is where I'm going to lose people. I borderline like it more than Temple of Doom.
Shun the
really do.
non-believer. Shun the
Really do.
non-believer.
I'm sorry.
But I will.
Even
I
if
mean,
yeah. Sorry, go
I
ahead.
will. No, you're fine. I was just gonna say that while I'm not anywhere near you in this with regard to this movie, I have to stress once again that where this film goes in its final act, did you expect that? Did you expect where it was going to go? Because my reaction when that happened, and I was like, "Wow, they're doing this. They're actually going here. They're literally going here." All right, I'm on board. I'm absolutely on board now.
I mean, and this kind of circles back to what we were talking about before, but I wasn't sure where they were going to go in terms of the film's lunacy, but I did expect it to get weird. This movie, all of them get super weird. All of them.
I would say
get
this.
super strange.
Yeah, I think where it ends up going, just from a narrative, practical standpoint, it's the most ludicrous thing this franchise ever done.
I don't agree with that.
I think it is. I think this is even more more strange, more ridiculous than Shia LaBeouf swinging with monkeys in Crystal Skull. Like where it goes is one of the most hilarious things I think I've seen in this franchise, and I absolutely ate it up and loved every second of it because it finally commits to something that I felt like had some personality and had some purpose.
Yeah.
Which again, that sounds like that's our biggest disparity there, and the way that it uses this new sense of place in a very ridiculous way, but also simultaneously in a very thematic and sincere way. Like that's not an easy balance to pull off, right? And
No.
somehow the film really does strike that balance very well. And I don't know if that's a Mangold thing, being able to find some middle ground there. Maybe it's all in the script or just in the way this movie was ultimately going to go anyway. But there's a balance there that really surprised me. I was really taken aback by that.
I still think the ending of Crystal Skull, like the aliens to me are way more bizarre and out of this world, literally, I guess, than what we get at the end of Dial of Destiny. I still maintain the nuclear explosion. I lose, like that loses more believability than what we get at the end of this film.
Yeah,
like, that moment alone.
If we were to do a top 3 ranking of the top 3 most ridiculous moments from Indiana Jones, my number 1 would be the ending of this movie. My number 2 would be the ending of this movie. My number 3 would be the ending of this movie.
See, this would be like 4th on my list.
Oh,
easily
gosh,
4th on my list. Easily. Not even close. This is not even the most bizarre of this franchise.
It's interesting that we're arguing here because I'm not saying that as a bad thing. I love where this movie goes.
I do too.
I think it's amazing.
I mean, the Raiders of the Lost Ark establishes this very, very well.
Oh, sure.
This is not a franchise where you don't need to get bogged down in the supernatural and weird. Like that's just where it's going to go.
This is why I mean this is kind of a side topic, I guess, but this is why I don't always like the argument about the ridiculousness of this franchise being a good or even a bad thing, because really the only argument against one or the other is that we reference movies like Raiders or Last Crusade because they're based off of religiosities that we know very well. And that automatically makes it, I guess, more quote unquote believable, which is just kind of bullcrap, if you ask me. I mean, like to other cultures, they would see those movies as the most ridiculous, right? And like all these movies, I think, have an equal dose of lunacy in the way that they fabricate history and religiosity for their own serial ways, right? Like that's the whole gimmick of Indiana Jones. Just some of them maybe handle it a little bit differently than others, but yeah, I a long-winded way of saying it's ridiculous. It's very ridiculous at the end of this. At the same time, though, it's still rooted in actual history. Like this is all about Archimedes and what was it called? The Antikythera, I believe it is, which is an actual device. Yeah, it is an actual device. Now, what the film says it does might not be true, but it's at least pulling some inspiration from documented history in some way, which I at least appreciate that the film is maintaining
And
that
that's
ethos
it.
of Indiana
Like,
Jones.
it's the thematic crux of it is vital.
Yeah.
In terms of the actual lunacy that we see, I will say this to me is why it's like third or fourth on this list.
Okay.
Because every other thing that we see in this franchise is based on some sort of supernatural or religious component that is not, there's no fundamental basis for it other than the supernatural. That's it. What we see at the end of this film is based in physics. It is based on the special and general relativity, geometry, and
I mean, it says
dimension.
mathematics. It says mathematics.
Mathematics.
That's what they say it all the time in the movie. Yeah.
It is. Again, is it possible? Probably not. Again, that's why it's absurd. There's a lunacy to it. Again, I'm not denying that, but it is at least based on something that has a mathematical foundation to it, where the religiosity foundation is completely made up. So to me, that's where
it's
what we see
completely
at the
made
end
up,
of this
sure,
film
but
is like fourth on the list of
still,
the crazy things we see.
But even like the Ark of the Covenant or the Holy Grail, there's at least documented history that speculates that there is purpose to those items and what they represent. Yeah,
I'm not talking about that.
Yeah.
Just like I'm not talking about the dial here.
Mm-hmm.
Those are artifacts that the film uses to go beyond what we know to be true. Does that make sense? I'm not talking about artifacts. I'm talking about how these films use those artifacts, how we go way beyond what we know to be true. And at least this film is based on some sort of mathematical reality, where the other films are based on nothing. They're based on these made up mythical things that we as humans invented for whatever reason. So those to me are more crazy because they're not based on anything. What we get in this film is that there's at least a foundation there. Now, is it absolutely insane? Yes, I agree. But to me, that's the difference. However, regardless of all that, that's just a silly fun debate to have. And that's why it's fourth on my list.
I did not expect this conversation to go this way, but that was kind of fun. I was going to say, get Christopher Nolan involved to actually, break the mathematical formula of what the heck's going on with the Dial of Destiny.
He himself has done a movie based on time in this manner. So and you know how that man feels about practicality and pragmatism.
Actually, yeah, you think about it.
I'm just saying.
The Dial of Destiny is a temporal pincer movement.
Exactly. Check and mate. So at any rate, we can debate that all day long. Well, but that to me is why this is last on my list of all the movies in that regard. However, it almost doesn't matter. What matters is the change of setting and how that comes back to the heart of this movie. That to me is why it's so fascinating. And to your point of how the film is able to kind of find this balance of lunacy, but also this true sincerity. Like to me, that sincerity was there all the way throughout, especially in Ford's performance and how the film does slow down. And it does do this. It does slow down to emphasize that reflection in Indiana Jones at every turn. So even inside the chaos, and we get bogged down in aesthetics and imitation and the Disney sheen and all that sort of jazz, but the heart is there, but it becomes a central focal point in ways that it hadn't previously in this final 20 minutes. So to me, I think that is why it's felt so much more and why people have maybe come around on it, because when we get there and it becomes the main thing, because it had built to it, we do feel it, whether, we realize it or not. I feel like that's how we get there. And then Harrison Ford and Waller-Bridge do such a good job within that sincerity that when he starts to choose history the way he does, it really is felt. And And for a moment, you really do think the film is going to end in this really strange, bizarre way. And I kind of wish that it did.
I was going to ask you, like, there is a moment where I thought, is it really going to end this way? And I don't know if it would have been disingenuous to the character of Indiana Jones. Maybe at this point in his life, it wouldn't have been, because it certainly works thematically, in the context of this film being seen in a vacuum. I think it makes total sense to maybe, crystallize it in a way that takes history in the most literal of forms and allows Indiana Jones himself to play a part in that.
Yes,
I think is a really interesting idea.
I love that. I love that.
Which is why, I mean, like, the actual ending of the film, I think, is pretty touching. I'll be honest. There is a wrap up of sorts in a way that's kind of, I almost want to say the word anticlimactic, but but I say it in a way that's kind of a compliment. Like, I like the softness of the film's ending. I like that it actually crystallizes in a way that's, what's the word I'm looking for? It's it's not really that grand, right? It actually ends in a very, like, full circle kind of way. In many ways, Indiana Jones ends where he begins, or begin, or, you know what I mean? And I kind of like that it's a very calming crystallization, but secretly, I kind of wish the movie also ended the other way, because I think that would have been really ballsy for it to do that.
I would have loved it, and the moment that it doesn't happen. Well, I will say this, because I don't want to necessarily give away spoilers.
Right.
The fact that it doesn't end that way is one talking point.
Mm-hmm.
I would have loved for the film to really commit to it. However, if it's not going to commit to it, the way it gets out of it, I think, is quintessential Indiana Jones.
I think they both work. They both work for their own respective reasons, whether it ends the way it actually does end, or if it were to end the other way around. I think they both have their own respective purpose.
I'm to be more clear, in case that was a little too vague.
Mm-hmm.
The final ending scene of this film, I think, is really great. I am specifically referring to a physical action that takes place specifically around Indiana Jones, that I think is really great. That undermines his decision as it relates to history. There is a physical action that takes place, and that physical gag, I think, is quintessential Indiana Jones. That's stuff we have seen in all of those films to one degree or another. And that, to me, was the most Spielberg-inspired thing.
Are you talking about the final shot of the movie? Like the
I'm talking about as that whole sequence ends up, as it relates to this new setting that we find ourselves in.
Mm-hmm.
There is a physical action toward Indiana Jones.
Okay, committed by another character.
That,
I know what you're talking about.
Is exactly what Spielberg would have done with this film. That's how he would have ended that sequence. That to me felt so Indiana Jones.
Mm-hmm.
And we've seen that countless times over in all of these films, that for that sequence to end that way, I thought was hilarious. Like, again, it kind of undermines the sincerity of the moment, but in this very Indiana Jones way that I thought was great. And then it leads to that final scene of the film, which, again, as I noted in my opening thoughts, the way this film uses Indiana Jones lore, specifically cameos, I think is really great. To me, that's how you use nostalgia, not to pander, but to add to the heart of the story.
No, and I won't disagree that the handling of past characters here, whether they're actually in the film or not. I even though I'm not high on this movie like you are, I never felt like the film was just pandering to fan service. I never felt that. I felt like it was at least trying to be its own thing, which I do respect. And even when other characters that we know are referenced, or whether they even appear in this movie, and the trailers did give it away that Sala is also in the movie, so I feel like it's okay to at least say that he has a very brief role. He's maybe in the movie for about maybe not even 2 minutes of screen time when you add it all up.
Yeah, it's pretty brief.
But Jonathan Rhys-Davies is actually really good in those moments.
Man, he's fun. Yeah.
He's actually, it's really tender. It's really sweet. And again, he's kind of tapping into the nostalgia at times, but he's also not. He actually feels like the same character in a completely new place. He's doing what Harrison Ford's doing in this movie, which I do appreciate.
Yeah, no, I thought he was really great. Should we reveal the one at the end? Do a little spoilers here?
Let's go ahead. We'll be brief about it. And I feel like the secret's kind of already out because
she talked about it.
She talked about it, and she's also been at the premieres and been doing countless interviews for it. But yes, Karen Allen does reprise her role as Marion Ravenwood. And for context, very briefly, but for context, the relationship between her and Indy had basically ended up in potential divorce after the death of Mutt when he chose to enlist in war, which I'll say the writing of how that kind of crystallized was a little bit annoying for me. And I don't know. It just, that felt like that wasn't as organically well revealed, mostly regarding to the character of Mutt, which we didn't need to see again, but just, I don't know. The writing of that didn't really work for me. But somehow the bringing back of Marion in those final minutes and the way that they harken back to that the kissing moment on the ship in Raiders, I don't know why it worked for me. I can't really explain it, but I kind of ate it up. I found it surprisingly touching and surprisingly poignant because I feel like it's mirroring something but meaning something different, which is when I think those moments work better, when they're trying to do two things at once.
Yeah. Well, maybe we've found the biggest disparity of this whole conversation, Brendan, because the writing of the moment when Indiana reveals what happened to his son, I think is one of the best scenes of the film.
Oh, I didn't like it. That just reeked of convenience. Oh, you didn't like Mutt? We'll just write him out.
Well, here's, I guess, perhaps more of a difference because I don't think it has anything to do with him. Like that moment, the beauty of that moment has nothing to do with that character. It's a little bit twofold because it is that scene on the boat we mentioned earlier between Indiana and Helena, where they talk about what is motivating them. Helena talking about money, the pragmatism of that, and as we've noted, the film does establish why, as it relates to her father and her childhood. Mm-hmm. Okay, well, Indiana doesn't feel that way. And there's a somber tone in the character throughout. And part of that is this overall reflection that I've been hearkening on a bazillion times in this conversation. But peeling that layer back a little bit further, he reveals something about his wife. He reveals that they are going through something at the moment. And he reveals to Helena that, their son was killed. It sparked this thing between them that they haven't been able to recover from since his death. So perhaps a character people didn't like, however, doesn't matter because that moment really wasn't about him. It was about Indiana and Marion and why there's a gap between them now as the events of this film start to unfold, how that affects his choices throughout this film, and how that ultimately affects his relationship and his dynamic with Helena even. So like all of that really does matter. And Harrison Ford is so good. Like in terms of his performance, that might be his best scene of performance in this film. It is absolutely touching and moving. And again, nothing to do with his son. His son is just a red herring in that moment, I guess. It's just a way to reveal this somber tone is all that it is. Well, as far as writing off the character, that's last on the list as far as I'm concerned.
Couldn't they have picked a better option than him choosing to enlist in war, though?
But the emotion doesn't feel as well earned at that point. Like, oh, I lost this nephew of mine. Okay, yeah, but that won't sting as much as a son will.
Well, it's not even that. It's like if Mutt chose to enlist, again, maybe I'm latching on to the character of Mutt specifically. I just don't buy at all that character would choose to enlist. And I kept thinking like the what of what that character would choose to do. This kind of gets back and made it maybe to our similar disparities that we have with regard to, let's say, I don't know, Luke Skywalker in The Last Jedi. Right? Because you've said you like what that character goes through, but you keep saying that the context of why Luke would behave the way he does against Ben Solo, that portion of that character arc is missing for you in that movie.
Yes.
And that's what I'm feeling about the way Mutt is written off in this movie. Just what leads him to want to enlist in the first place. There's like, I don't buy that for a second.
No, you're not wrong.
Yeah, well, and
that's a problem with Crystal Skull. Like I agree.
Maybe it is a problem with Crystal Skull, but the character that we got at least introduced in Crystal Skull, I think there's no way this character would enlist just to spite his dad. He would find another way to do that.
And look, I don't disagree with that. The difference for me is that Luke is still a massive character in The Last Jedi, like huge character. Like drives so much of that film. Mutt is literally a line of dialogue.
He's literally a mutt. He's literally a mutt.
Literally, like he has nothing to do with this movie. Like, and you're not wrong. Why he would choose that? It certainly reverts against his character. Who cares though? Like, it does not matter to me because what it mostly does is, regardless of how he chose it, who knows? Maybe he had a conversation with Indiana, but you're right. That context is gone. We don't know.
I need both the context and the drama, but I mean, the drama, I could at least see where you're coming from because the performance is very strong in the moment. I was
care about is that emotion. Like
I was blinded by just the practicality of it, and maybe that's more on me. I'll admit that, but yeah, I was definitely distracted by the way it was chosen to go in that direction from a writing standpoint.
And that's. Yeah, that's fair. Like, to me, it was just a line of dialogue to establish something much, much larger and bigger and more important as it relates to the somberness in Indiana and what's driving a wedge between him and Marion.
Who would have thought we would have talked this much about Mutt during this review?
I did not anticipate. He's literally a line of dialogue. That's it.
Is the name Mutt even mentioned?
I know. He just says his son.
Yeah.
So that's the thing. So like, you know, like regardless of how he got there,
I can't help but laugh at that.
I know. He just said, my son went to war, he died. And that's all I need. That's all the context I need. My son went to war, he chose to go, he died, and now there's a wedge between me and him. That's all I need to know. That's all the context that I think is necessary here. And I think the performance is so good at giving credence to it that when we get to the end of that film and we see them reconnect, part of it is perhaps nostalgia, but I think it's mostly the heart of this film and how it gets to that ending beat that makes for such a beautiful send-off to the character.
Well, I think Karen Allen is really good in that moment, too.
She's
I think
good.
That's what helps. Again, like that's a moment where I think when we talk about the performative aspect of the movie, maybe overcoming some of its narrative or aesthetic blemishes that bothered me more than it bothered you, like that's a moment at the end where I was able to kind of really overlook some of those problems and just focus on the emotional vibe that was being presented to us. And I definitely sensed it in those final minutes.
Well, now you're making me want like to live the multiverse, since that's a big thing now.
Yeah.
To go back to The Last Jedi. I want to see a version of that film in the multiverse where Luke's not really in it and he's just a line of dialogue to say, he did this thing to me, and that's why I'm bad now. No, like I want to know more, but okay, it's one line of dialogue. I can't get too mad at it.
That sounds amazing, actually. Anyway. Well, there are a lot of other compelling characters in that movie. I'm sure they can still carry it.
For sure. Final thoughts on Dial of Destiny.
We didn't mention John Williams yet.
I was going to say, that was my last thought here.
Yeah. I mean, it's John Williams. Of course you're going to like the music in a John Williams scored movie, right? I mean, it's always going to be good. I will say, I don't think it's his best work with this franchise. And a lot of it mostly works best when he chooses to bring back the great themes. I think that's when the film is at its most musically effective, right? And that's something I don't think we give enough credit to composers sometimes, especially when a composer is returning to a franchise that they're really known for. Is it's not just about what new melodies that they're able to derive. Sometimes that matters little. You know, it's also about when a classic theme that we know is chosen to come back.
Yeah.
Because it could easily be overused. It could become kind of stale. And I think here it's well timed. Any problems I have with the film from a editorial standpoint and a narrative standpoint, I think the music is not part of the problem. I think John Williams does a good job sequencing his classic themes with some pretty good new themes. I mean, it's a functional score. It adds an energy to it, but it's well timed. I think he paces himself well when he chooses to reprise the great themes here.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think it's very good. I love when composers create themes that they can go back to, especially when they're when they're such a big part of these movies. I think that's a huge reason why why Marvel brought back that Avengers theme for those last two movies, because they had kind of gotten away from themes.
Yeah.
And then they're like, let's bring Sylvester back. And you can't deny, regardless of how you think about those films, when he brings back that main theme in those movies, audiences responded.
They do, yeah.
And I think blockbusters on the whole have kind of gotten away from this a little bit. So John Williams bringing that back, and you're right, the timing of it I think is great. He doesn't overly indulge in that main theme, but
he does not overly use it
when it's there.
Yeah. And I think that's why a lot of modern blockbusters, especially within a franchise that have these real closely associated musical themes to them, that I feel like that's why they're afraid to keep bringing them back, because they don't want to overuse it. I think another franchise that has actually done a really good job at doing this, despite having different composers come in for some of the respective films, is the Harry Potter franchise.
Yes.
I think that's a great example, because each movie had its own musical vibe to it, but the classic John Williams theme would still make an appearance in every movie, obviously. But it was well timed and well executed. But I could see why some studios would be afraid to really commit to that, because they don't want to run into that trap, which it's very easy to run into that trap.
Speaking of John Williams and Harry Potter, I'm sorry, this is a tangent side haul, but I mentioned earlier I watched Azkaban last night.
Oh, yeah.
And while that Harry Potter theme, Hedwig's theme, is iconic, it's really great. Honestly, one of John Williams's best, quote unquote, main themes, in my opinion.
Mm-hmm.
But more underratedly, and I'm not even sure what it's called. I'll just dub it Harry's theme.
Are you thinking of the moment when he flies on Buckbeak?
No.
Oh.
There's a recurring motif in Azkaban that he reprises whenever Harry is talking about his parents.
Okay.
This is a musical cue that recurs several times throughout, and it always emphasizes the emotional arc of Harry in that film. And I don't know if it's because I was a couple of drinks in when we were watching this last night.
Yeah, it does help.
I kept hearing that in a hyper focused way than I ever did before, and it is so good. It is unbelievably great.
I sometimes think Azkaban is the best scored.
I was just about to say that. It honestly, I think, is the best scored of those movies. I was this is some of my favorite John Williams work. Because you do get the classic Harry Potter theme throughout as well, but this new Harry theme that we hadn't heard yet, in that franchise to that point. Oh man, it's so good.
Well, it's not even just that. You also have the song Double Toil and Trouble.
That one too.
Yeah,
man, what a soundtrack.
What a soundtrack. Are we going to do another Harry Potter retrospective in the future?
I think we should.
Yeah.
Well, part of why we're doing this is because I think for my birthday this year, we're going to have a Harry Potter themed thing.
Oh, okay.
And this came about because I haven't celebrated my birthday in literally, 20 years. Probably not since high school.
Yeah,
and, I said this randomly one Friday night when we were all just kind of hanging out, and they're like, well, look, we got to do something this year for your birthday. And I was like, sure, let's do a randomly. I was just like, let's do Harry Potter. Actually, it's not random because back in January, I did a whole rewatch of the films before I knew that this was going to be a thing.
Yeah, yeah.
And so since I was in the middle of a rewatch, I think that's why it came to mind immediately. I was like, yeah, let's do a Harry Potter themed thing. And they're like, yeah, let's do it. So I think we're committed to it now.
Oh,
So anyway.
yeah. You've got to do that now, and you've got to take it really seriously. Like you got to do this like an annual party. And each time it's going to be based on either one of the movies or one of the books. So the first thing will be the Sorcerer's Stone. The second one will be the Chamber of Secrets, and you have to decorate your house based on that story. So then one time you'll have a literal Chamber of Secrets somewhere in your house. Maybe you can dress up one of the rooms as Azkaban the next year.
That could be fun.
Maybe the next year put a giant maze out in the backyard, like the final task of the Goblet of Fire. So yeah, you can take it seriously. It'll cost a lot of money, but you can take it seriously.
I don't know if it'll be a yearly thing, but my friend Rachel, she loves to decorate and do things like this. Which was part of the reason this came up, because she's like, once I said I haven't celebrated, she's like, I love to do these things. So I think she's talked about it. She's going full out in terms of decorating and making it like a fully themed party.
Nice. All right.
So
if you don't have to do the work, then all power to you.
Exactly. I just have to show up. So I just got to get my robe and my wand and show up.
Yeah, maybe I'll show up too, uninvited.
You should. Yeah, you're totally invited for sure.
Can they send invites out on Owls?
I need to do that. Yeah. get some owl service going on.
Yeah, there you go.
At any rate, Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny. I liked it more than Brendan did.
Yeah.
And look, I didn't get a chance to revisit Temple of Doom. I did rewatch some of the Indiana Jones movies. I like Temple of Doom. I can't deny its weirdness and Spielberg's craft to it. I just don't think some of it ages all that well. And visually speaking, I don't think Dial of Destiny will age all that well either. However, of the two evils, I do think that the heart of Dial will age better for me than the things that I love about Temple of Doom. So
fair enough.
In time, I think that's why after Raiders, after Crusade, Dial might be the next film for me.
Interesting.
Right now it's, fine. I'll put it fourth. It's miles ahead of Crystal Skull for me.
Which is where I currently have it now, just in totality. I jokingly said at the beginning of this review that I would probably rank the final act way higher than the first 2/3 of Dial of Destiny. But if I am looking at it as a whole, I'll still take it slightly over Crystal Skull because of where it ends and where it chooses to crystallize those emotional arcs and those characters, which surprisingly worked for me. It's just getting there I didn't really care for, but in totality, the way it sticks to landing, I'll still give Dial of Destiny the edge over Crystal Skull.
Okay. Well, there you go. That's our conversation of Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny in theaters now.
I don't even know what accent that was, but I like it.
I don't know either. I wasn't really trying to do one. It was just more of like, I guess, like an emphasized cinematic voice.
Sounds like you're trying to do like a trailer voice, like in a world where these people review Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny.
Yeah, it's more inspired by that than anything.
Okay, fair enough.
This movie, its opening box office was like 130 million.
I think I saw 160 million as 160.
Yeah. Okay, something like that.
Oh no, correct me if I'm wrong, but I mean, I my understanding is that the projections are not as high as some people thought it would do for an opening weekend like this. But here. I don't know.
Indiana Jones, Dial of Destiny, box office. Here, we're looking this up on the fly.
All right.
According to what I'm reading here is 152 million. Okay. I don't know how accurate or up to date that is. That's just the first thing I saw that popped up here. So,
yeah.
So, you're probably close. Maybe it's around that 160 million.
Could be rounding mark. Just for a whole rounding there, but I don't know. Yeah. But like I said, from what I understand, it seems as though people are saying it wasn't as positive of a weekend gross as people were hoping for, especially with a movie with the name Indiana Jones tied to it. But I don't know. It could still be very early to tell. this could have legs. Maybe certainly more so than the Flash, I think.
Yeah, well, I hope it does as well. From what I read, this was around-ish the projections that it was about to make. Either way, the problem isn't that it made $160 million in its opening weekend. In most cases, that would be a fine opening. The problem is the budget for this movie was like $350 million.
It's ridiculous. Yeah.
That's insane. Plus marketing.
Yeah.
So this is going to need some legs if it's going to be in the green when it's all
Just make cheaper movies. Just make cheaper movies.
And that's a large, like, whatever the conversation was last week, we're going to need a sequel to
let's
it.
add a second part to that. It's like, don't just make good movies, make more inexpensive movies.
Yeah, because, like, I think I read something that Raiders of the Lost Ark, by today's standards, including inflation, would be still like $60 million with inflation.
Yeah.
So,
and that's its budget you're talking about.
yeah, that's its budget. Yeah, that's the
insane.
production budget.
That's insane.
That's pretty wild.
That's a fifth. It's more like a sixth of Dial of Destiny.
I know. Wild. At any rate, thanks for listening, everybody. Thanks for watching. Be sure to subscribe. Let us know if you agree or disagree with any of our takes. And we will see you all next time on the In Session Film Podcast. Hey, I liked it. Take that for what it's worth, I guess.